Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the final interview of our Expo for 2021. We're about to get some career advice with Dr. Karl. Dr. Karl, thank you for joining us here this evening.
Thank you, my honour.
It's quite cool to be able to have you on the couch here, to be able to talk all things about, careers, about STEM, about the world that we're currently experiencing. But Dr. Karl, can I ask you, what was high school like for you? And what some of the subjects that you did to lead you to where you are today?
Well, I come from a different time, way back in the past, back when the Australian government thought that education was a worthwhile investment in the future. So I've had 28 years of education all for free, including 16 years at university. Yeah. And so the high school education fit into that same category. And back in those days, you just did the boring straight stuff, which was just you're either arts or you were science, and if you were sciencey, then you just did maths and physics and chemistry and maybe chucked in a language, and I just did all that boring stuff like everybody else did.
And that was a part of Year 12, you just did your science, your maths?
Yeah, physics and maths, maths 1, maths 2, chemistry, French, Latin, English. Latin's handy because it teaches you grammar and teaches you how to think and form sentences. They're all good.
And leading outside of school, did you always want to go in being a scientist? You've written books, you host television shows and radio shows. Did you always think you were going to end up where you are today?
No, basically my life has been kind of like a paddle pop stick in the gutter of life on a rainy day, and the currents have just washed me this way and that. So I've drifted through a whole bunch of things, like doing some of the first. Do you remember a TV channel called MTV, Music Television?
Of course.
Yeah, I did some of the first music television videos in Australia when I was a filmmaker, and I was a taxi driver for the best part of a decade, and a few of my friends got killed and various other bad things happened and good things happened. And I was a TV weatherman and a labourer and a roadie for rock and roll bands. You heard of Bo Diddley?
Of course.
Blues, and Chuck Berry once. And you just drifted through different careers, and TV weatherman was fun. That was really good.
I can imagine. I think it's quite interesting because a lot of people think the transition into careers is quite linear, but we know it works in ebbs and flows. What would be kind of some of your advice to young people who are listening tonight, looking at trying to understand this new world of work? What would be some of the advice you'd give them?
Firstly, don't be afraid to make a mistake. If you don't make a mistake, you don't make anything. Just try not really hard not to make the same mistake over and over. You're allowed 2 goes at making the same mistake. Third one, you're being a bit careless, right? So don't be afraid of making mistakes. Party like you die tomorrow, but study like you live forever. So live in the moment, but also have long-term stuff. Healthy mind and healthy body. So do exercise, eat well, and bear in mind you're just going to make mistakes. In general, with each career, I found that on average, it takes you about 1.5 years to kind of master a job, and then you can kind of move on thinking that you've got all you'll get out of that particular job or career. In some cases, though, it's a bad place within a few months, so you may as well just go anyway. It's also handy to work for the belly of the beast, the forces of evil. And I've done it a few times, work for people who are environmentally bad. And when you see it from the inside, you get a different appreciation. You realise what they're doing and how we can make the world a better place.
And I'm really glad you finished on that point because, for a lot of young people, a lot of Gen Zs, they have a real social passion about them, about social impact and environmental impact, and sustainability really is something that they're very passionate about. What would be some of your wisdom that you'd give to, this generation who are about this social impact and environmental impact?
Well, think of the example of the ozone hole. And so back in 1985, after decades of study, the scientists said, hey, the ozone hole exists, the ozone layer is thinning, and it's caused by these chemicals, and within 2 years, the world banned them. So with regard to fossil fuels, though, around 1990, the scientists said global warming is real and this is what's causing it. And then the fossil fuel companies set up a deliberate, expensive disinformation campaign reaching $1 billion a year by the year 2013. and we've still got problems 30 years down the line with fossil fuels. So my advice from that, you said, what's the advice? Politics. P for politics, P for power. I ran for politics for the Federal Senate in 2007 and failed. But from that, I learned that that's where the power is. There's little stuff you can do around the edges, but if you want to fix global warming in the environment, go for politics. And if you don't go, if when somebody says to you, hey, run for politics, your reply is, oh, I wouldn't do that, they're too crooked, they have won. At that moment, you have let them win. All that is required for evil to win is that good people do nothing. And by you doing nothing, then you let the bad people win.
One of the inspiring things to see is, this cohort that have demonstrated their passion through the protests that they were leading last year, to be able to have that voice. How important is it for young people to share those passions and be able to push the boundaries into the new world that we're experiencing?
If they don't, it'll be the same as the old world. But if they do, it'll be a better world. And we've got to make it better because global warming is ramping up and the costs are getting very significant now. And it'll be cheaper in the medium and the long term if we go totally renewable into a greener world, and be better for everybody's health. But we need people to run for politics, either supporting people or actually doing it. Just giving up on it is not going to fix it. You got to do it.
Well, I think that's probably a good segue into a next question, is that, finding the truth of information, finding a source of truth. For a lot of young people, they're transitioning out of school. We've seen industries change. We get different influences and different information from individuals about where to go or what to do. How do you find your source of truth?
Google Scholar, not Google. Google, as a search engine, is about as trustworthy as a drunk man standing in a pub in his own vomit in a toilet cubicle, scribbling on the wall with black text to colour, right? Google Scholar. So just type into your search engine Google Scholar, and then suddenly you're in this land where you search the peer-reviewed literature. Now, you've got access to these full-on peer-reviewed scientific, medical, engineering, etc., literature. The advantage is that you can get the abstract, in other words, the summary of the article, for free. But you can't get the whole article. Sometimes you can get it for free, sometimes you have to pay $30. So my journals bill is about $10,000 a year. So that way I can get the information I want. So that's where I get my true information. Not everybody has been taught this concept of what you can trust and not trust. Plus, there are deliberate disinformation campaigns going on, especially with regard to climate change.
What would you say has been the most important thing that you've learned throughout your career? Do you have one principle that you consistently go back to?
Try to stick to the facts and avoid opinions. It was interesting. I was watching Sky TV for 2 nights in a row just because I'd never watched it, and I wanted to see what it was like, and it seemed to be totally free of facts and full of opinions. And some of the opinions were wrong, and then the people say, oh, well, I'm not a journalist, I'm a commentator, and that's why I can say that global warming isn't real, because I'm a commentator and an entertainer, not a journalist. So stick to the facts, avoid opinions. You'll do better with truth in the long run than not. I know it's hard.
It is hard. Do you remember have you ever had in your experience some profound advice that has helped you along your journey?
In general, blood is thicker than water. Family, you can normally count on. Friends, you got to have friends. Friends are really important. You want to have a healthy mind in a healthy body. What else?
Who's been your biggest inspiration?
Basically, the last person I've read who said something clever to me. So I've been following all sorts of people along the way because everybody's got clever things to say. So Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize winner, said science is a way to not get fooled. So it's a tool. It's not a bunch of facts. A bunch of facts, that's an encyclopedia. But science is a way of thinking and looking at the world and understanding it so you can discover all sorts of interesting things and get closer to the truth. And the path's a bit bumpy and sometimes you get lost. So that was one very good thing. But science is not everything. You might discover that your love is really 17th century Mongolian literature. In my case, I just fell in love with filmmaking and stayed that way for a few years, or with being a roadie for rock and roll bands, or being a TV weatherman. So and test driving four-wheel drives through the Australian outback. So I did that for 20 years. So there's so many different pathways you'll go along.
Have you always found that you've done something that you fundamentally enjoyed?
I've tried to enjoy what I'm doing, and if I'm not enjoying it, then there's there's various forces coming in. So on one hand, I need to have a job, but on the other hand, I want to have a job that I like. But on the other hand, I'm stuck with this because I haven't got the new job. But on the other hand, I'm still learning from this crappy job that I'm in. Once I'm at the stage where I've learned everything I can from the job, I'm going to get out there as fast as I can. And that's hard. So when I changed from being a TV weatherman to being a science journalist working from home, my income went from, this was back in 1990, from about $65,000 a year to about $5,000 a year. But luckily my wife was able to support me.
And do you think that this new generation, the Gen Zs, are quite an aspirational bunch and really have that social purpose and social drive? What's your outlook on the future with such a passion-driven generation?
Well, their emotional IQ is much higher than previous generations, and they can be much more sensitive. Bearing in mind you're talking about across a whole range of things, so they have that advantage. The second advantage is that they're smarter. They are the smartest generation ever in the history of the human race. It's called the Flynn effect, and we know this from IQ tests done beginning with the American military in 1932. And they did IQ tests on everybody who went into the military from 1932 under hard military conditions. None of this, please, sir or madam, can I go to the toilet, look up the answer on my smartphone or on my hand where I've written it? And so the IQ's been going up by 9 IQ points every generation since 1932 in America and everywhere in the world where we've tried to measure it. So one bit of good news is that the current generation is the smartest generation. We don't know why, but we know there's real. Secondly, they are living in the most peaceful time ever in the history of the human race. So first thing, IQ is higher. Secondly, you're in the smartest time ever in the history of the human race. It's a bit bumpy. And thirdly, we can fix and reverse global warming. There's nothing stopping us. The technology and the science is here. What we need is the next generation, that's you dudes, to take over and become politicians and run the world for the next generation and their children, not just for the next quarter or the next press conference in 15 minutes.
How often do you find that you're asking questions and you're not sure of answers and you just have that thirst for knowledge?
Many times a day. The trouble is that as you learn more, imagine it's like a ball, and that ball of knowledge that you have is this big, and out there is everything you don't know. So as the ball of your knowledge gets bigger, well, the surface area where it intersects everything you don't know gets bigger. So there's more you don't know. The more you know, the more you don't know. And asking questions is the best way to learn. And unfortunately, some people think that asking questions is uncool because it shows that you don't know everything. Like, what's the activation energy of the 6 PDF suborbital of Americium-221? I don't know. I've got no idea, right? I can look it up in Wikipedia if I need to, right? So don't be, and in fact, I've discovered this in the sciences, that they are very open about not knowing and also very open about admitting when they make mistakes. And that's a wonderful thing because it lets you go further. There's another book called Black Box Thinking, which is part of it goes into why there are so few deaths in the aviation industry. When planes were flying, we were getting 3 billion flights a year, passenger flights a year, and maybe 100 deaths. Mate, that's incredibly good, much better than any other industry. And the thing is, you want to have a mode of thinking where you could admit your mistake and change the system so it doesn't happen again. So I made a mistake, but let's fix it so that somebody else doesn't make the same mistake. Let's change the system so that we can go down a better pathway. So the medical profession is a bit slow to learn that. The aviation industry got onto it really early.
Well, I think that's probably really good information for anyone who's listening, that you're meant to make mistakes, and it's how you grow. And I know there'd be a lot of young people and students listening tonight who'd be saying, well, I don't know what I want to do with myself. I don't know what I want to study. I don't know what I want to do for the rest of my life, because it's that question that we have in school that you're kind of meant to know. How would you explain, or what would be some of your budding advice to a student who next year may be going off into university? We've seen the class of 2020 have had the impact of coronavirus and the pandemic. What would be your words of wisdom for someone who just plain and simply doesn't know?
Go with the flow. Previously, I would have said, take a year off, spend the first part of the year earning money in a job where people are rude to you. The reason for that is that when you get fabulously wealthy, you won't be rude to people who work in jobs where people are rude to them. And then in the second half of the year, take that money and travel around the world and just see different things. And so my son and my two daughters did that, and it turned out to be good for them. You can't quite do that now, but you could do the travelling around Australia as we're coming out of the coronavirus. There are grounds for not going through into further education. Oh, hang on, I've just got to back up one here. Okay, our education system is kind of broken in Australia. And it comes from the very top because we don't see education as a worthwhile investment in the future. And we've got a system in Australia where we don't respect the trades. That is crazy. If you don't have plumbers, you don't have society, right? So in the Scandinavian countries, they tend to take everybody through the same course to year 9, and then you can decide, but it's not a lifelong decision, that you'll go into the trades or you'll go into academic or something else. And it's not as though if you don't go into academic, you're a failure. And no. It's a more open system. So the thing is to realise that you've got many things you can go into, and you won't know what the first one is. So my very first job was rowing a rowboat up and down a river inside the steelworks in Wollongong. It was an aluminium rowboat, and sometimes the river would be bright orange, and sometimes it'd be bright green, depending on what poisons they were throwing into the river. But either way, the aluminium rowboat would corrode within a year. That's how bad the water was, right? So that was my experience in working inside the belly of the beast. And you just got to go into each job knowing that it might not be the one for you, but you don't know what that job will be. Just keep on going in there thinking, I want to be happy, I want to be creative, I want to do the right thing by my bosses. If I end up being a boss, I want to do the right thing by the people who are working for me, etc., etc. And just keep trying things. But on the other hand, you do want to have income. Oh, look, everybody should study some economics. I made a big mistake in not studying some economics. So it's worthwhile doing that as part of your studies, you know, at least some sort of basic financial course. So you don't get fooled when the politicians talk about economics. So one thing the politicians have been saying is the reason we haven't got enough vaccine in Australia is because of supply side problems. That means nothing. What they really meant to say was, we really stuffed up and we didn't bid enough when they had the auctions, and so we missed out in supplying with vaccine. And when they say things like, the stock market went down because of interest in renewables, what they meant with wealthy foreign investors didn't like it when Australia decided to go for renewables. So read the book, and this is a very important book to read. Actually, you might not have to study a course in economics. Read the book Econobabble by Richard Dennis, Denniss, Econobabble. And once you've read that, and then you listen to the politicians, you realise they're just talking gibberish.
So that will lead me into the two last questions that I've got there, because there was some absolute nuggets of gold there. Dr. Karl, what would you do to the education system if you were a politician? Is a question we've received.
If I were the dictator of Australia, the kind and benevolent, beloved dictator for life of Australia, the glorious People's Republic of Australia, I would make education that it would be very high quality and free. Okay, now here's a basic principle that I learned in Texas. If you give a cat $100, you don't have a lion. All you got is a wealthy cat. So if you pay teachers more, you don't necessarily get better education. So the teachers should be paid more, but they have to jump through a few hoops. And they have to have a master's degree in education paid for by the state, and a master's degree in the field that they're teaching in, and a salary of at least $150,000 a year in today's money, and they can progress up, earning more money, and still remain a teacher. Because often, the teachers who are really gifted can't afford to pay a house unless they give up teaching and go into being a principal. right? So we want the gifted teachers to stay in there. So we should have a completely public system that is a very high standard and open to everybody. The Australian education system is remarkable in two ways. Firstly, Australia has the highest penetration of private schools. 30% of the kids get educated in them. Thirdly, Australia is the only government in the world, the only federal government in the whole world, where the federal government gives more money to the private companies that happen to run schools than it does to the government schools. Isn't that weird? And I had this weird, heartbreaking experience where I went out to one school in the western suburbs where they received $5,000 from the federal government, and out of that they had to pay for an accountant to make sure they spent it wisely, and they didn't have enough money to to fix up everything, so they had a broken window or two. In the morning I went there. In the afternoon I went to a school within 15 kilometres of them. This school had 17 cricket fields. Not cricket pitches, right? I'm not talking cricket pitches, I'm cricket fields. And an Olympic swimming pool. And an underground rifle range. And they just received a grant from the government for $3 million to build a new driveway. I think that money could have been spent more wisely. So what would I do if I were the beloved dictator for life of the People's Glorious Republic of Australia? Bring in a free and high-quality education system all the way from baby jail to primary school, to high school, to university, to the trades, etc., etc. The trades are essential.
And do you think, as my last question, I was going to loop back to it, but vocational education as an industry, trades and whatnot, are often kind of diminished and disrespected. What's your perception of the the vocational sector and those vocational industries?
The vocational industries are essential for the country. No plumbing, no carpentry, no civilization. If you can't get rid of your sewage, you haven't got a civilization. You absolutely need the tradies to do high quality work. And I can recommend, if anybody wants to go into being a tradie, you could get a job in Antarctica. Because I was in Antarctica at the Australian base, and it's really neat getting a job there as a tradie, but you've got to be the sort of person who does the best that they can at all times and will even do stuff when nobody's looking. So you paint both sides of everything, even though you don't, because if you don't do it properly, somebody can die. So the trades are absolutely essential, and we've got to give them better. But unfortunately, we had, I think it was a Labor government in Australia that increased personal taxes, reduced company taxes, and killed the trades TAFE colleges.
I tend to agree with you, Dr. Karl, that the idea of education and raising the profile of education, and I think a lot of more theoretical, practical learning is something which should be brought in. Do you agree that or what's your perspective now on the current education system when it is very much so factory worker-like, industrial revolution, where set times, set classes versus the world of the work of today?
Today's educational system in Australia is fundamentally broken. Firstly, it doesn't respect teachers, but secondly, it doesn't respect the biology of the high school students and their need for sleep. Oh my gosh. So what happens is that when you're born, you need about 12, 13, 14 hours of sleep. And as you head towards puberty, it gradually drops down to your boring old parents, about 8 hours a night, going to bed at about 9 o'clock at night or something like that. Bang on puberty, two things happen with regard to your pineal gland in your brain around there, right? And the two things are that you make more melatonin. So you need 10 hours sleep. You're not being evil, but you need, from when you're a teenager, when you hit puberty till about your early mid-20s, you need 10 hours sleep. And secondly, you need it later. More of it gets produced, but later. And I remember as a child being awake and listening to my parents' clock go bong, bong, bong every quarter hour. And I, as a high school student, would be awake till midnight. And I just couldn't go to sleep. I wanted to go to sleep. And it was nothing that I was being evil. It was just the melatonin. So if you do the experiment with high school students where you say, oh, here, I'll just have a lie down here. We're just going to do an experiment on you. Just feel free to go to sleep. We'll just put these electrodes and just monitor what you're doing. And they will drop off into the restful sleep, not in 3/4 of an hour, in 5 minutes. They are permanently sleep deprived. In general, on average, high school students go through their whole high school education sleep deprived, and on a weekend when they sleep in, they're not being evil, they're just trying to catch up. And so it's wrong that we start high school at 9 o'clock in the morning. It should be more like 11 o'clock. So that's one thing I'd change.
Interesting, because yeah, the detrimental effects of lack of sleep has been. I don't know if you've read Matthew Walker's book.
No, tell me about it.
Sleep, or basically just it talks that we as humans don't get enough sleep, and we almost abuse it, and that there is a bit of a stigma attached to less sleep and the idea of the hustle and whatnot. But it's so detrimental because the body and the mind, to be creative, to be able to communicate, to be able to have emotional intelligence, needs sleep. And I think I haven't actually thought of it like that, that especially in high school when you've got extracurricular activities, be that sport, be that classes, kind of you're starting at almost 7:30 and sometimes you're finishing at 9:30 at night, and you've just got all this education and learning and development that, the impact of that sleep would just be so important.
When they've done studies with schools, starting later and finishing later, they're finding that the students do better, the family life is better, and I know this is a weird thing to think of, but the crime rate by the high school students drops to practically zero. So the other aspect of it is the needing sleep is the two sides of who you are. And who you are is two things. One, it's a reflection of what you take in from the outside world, like you read this book and that book, and you steal the good bits, and that becomes part of who you are. And the second part is when you switch everything off and you just see what bubbles up from inside you. You switch off all the outside world, and suddenly these thoughts start appearing in your brain. You think, where'd that come from? Hey, I'm liking that. So you need both. And sleep lets you rebuild what your inner self is. And if you don't get that sleep, if you don't have the me time, suddenly all you are is a reflection of everybody around you, and you haven't given yourself time for the inner you to come up.
And Dr. Karl, our last question for our expert before we wrap it up for another year. It's a question we've asked a lot at year 13, but what would you do if money was no object?
What, with regard to
how
working or living or what?
Working, living, how would you spend your time?
I would continue more travel through the Australian outback. So in Australia, 40% counts as desert under the definition of less than 200 millimetres of rain a year, and 80% is too dry to grow on. And depending on where to grow crops, and depending on how you look at it, there's about 15 or 17 deserts in Australia. There's different ways of defining it, and I've been through most of them. So I'd like to take the family through on the bottom half of the Canning Stock route, and there's a desert in in South Australia I haven't visited, the Moon Desert. So I'd also like to teach my youngest daughter how to drive on sand. It's not particularly hard; it only takes you about a day to learn. But I just haven't had a chance to teach her. But the other two I have taught how to drive on sand, and it's just wonderful. Like on our longest trip, we started off at Alice Springs. We then went west for 1,000 kilometres, turned right, went north for 1,000 kilometres, and in that 2,000 kilometre trip, we saw only one group of travellers who came through, and the rest of that month that took us 2,000 kilometres, we didn't see anybody else, day in and day out.
Wow.
And it was just a wonderful trip, and we were never more than 30 metres away from each other, no phone, no distractions, just each other. It was just a truly glorious time. So I'd like to spend some time just with me and the family together.
Outstanding. Well, Dr. Karl, I think from behalf of myself and everyone attending here, to have some career advice from Dr. Karl, career advice from Karl is quite cool, and I'd like to thank you for attending the Year 13 Expo.
It's been a great honour, and Year 13 folk, I expect you to run for politics and make the world a better place. Please let me know who you are so I can vote for you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Karl.
Thank you.